temple, laid siege to Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple. So he has a great lesson to learn. God has a great lesson to teach him. And what is that? What lesson does Nebuchadnezzar have to learn? What's the theme of the book? God is in control. God rules in the kingdoms of men. So Nebuchadnezzar, God really is going to, especially in these two chapters we're going to look at tonight, focus on teaching Nebuchadnezzar that great lesson that he needs to learn. That he didn't do that on his own. God allowed him to.
That's right. All right. Any questions or anything as we come into chapter 4? So we're near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as we come into chapter 4. The reason I say that is because these events happen later on. We don't have an exact date. I think I can give you basically an exact date for chapter 5, which is 539 BC. But for this, we're probably looking somewhere near the end of this period right here. So getting close to the 560s or so. All right, all that being said, we come to the first 3 verses. Now, these first 3 verses, in some old translations, and I'm not talking about like the King James, I'm talking about like the Aramaic translation of this. These are the last 3 verses to the previous chapter. Now, that is that it's written in that translation, it's kind of identified as the conclusion to the previous story, which is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which makes a lot of sense that this would be the conclusion of that. Nebuchadnezzar writing to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, this message, I'm going to read it in just a second, about the power and the authority of God. But most translations now view this kind of as a statement that we are given. We kind of get the conclusion before we get the story that led Nebuchadnezzar to it. That's kind of how it's framed in your Bibles, right? So you'll read chapters 4, 1 through 3, and you're kind of like, well, what would make Nebuchadnezzar say that? And I think then we read the rest of the chapter, we see what brought Nebuchadnezzar to that conclusion, and then we kind of have this summarized again as we come to the end of the chapter. So my note on it is that this is the conclusion of the account before we get the account in our minds. So Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, he says, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. So what does Nebuchadnezzar recognize about God as he writes that to his people? That he's all powerful, that he's almighty. Yeah. That anything else? That he's everlasting, right? That he's going to reign forever. Now, as we look at this account at the beginning, I don't know that Nebuchadnezzar has that full grasp of that. I think he's closer than a lot of pagan kings would have been. I don't know that he has that full grasp of it. But by the time we get to the end of the chapter, we'll see how he came to that idea, which is why I think it fits really well as an intro to chapter 4.
Do you think that what Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego has already shown him might have something to do with what he says here as well?
Very well, because he actually, when he calls for Daniel this time, it's like they're on familiar terms. Mm-hmm. I know who you are, and I know who the God you represent is. So maybe it's kind of based on what he's already seen, he can say this kind of stuff, and then we get this report almost from a Nebuchadnezzar perspective. I mean, verse 4 starts, I, Nebuchadnezzar. Mm-hmm. So we get Nebuchadnezzar's explanation of how he can have such confidence in God's power. All right. You want to take us from 4 on? Or how
I can. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. So this is something that we've seen before, right? So first of all, what have we already said about the Babylonian Empire? What do we know about it? It was wealthy. Okay. What else? It was powerful. And, all nations of the world at this time would have known about the Babylonian Empire. It was a beautiful, wealthy place. And Nebuchadnezzar was there, and he was enjoying what basically he had built when this dream comes to him, like we have already seen happen before. So, verse 6. Therefore I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. Now, I found that interesting, and you might want to comment on this too, but you would think that Nebuchadnezzar has been through this before, right? And who did he call on at first to interpret his first dream? These same people. Were they able to do it? No, they were not. But yes, he was going to make them tell him what the dream was. That's exactly right. In this circumstance, he doesn't even do that. He just wants them to tell him the interpretation of the dream, right? But you would think that Nebuchadnezzar would know by now that they wouldn't be able to do that. But when they can't, look at verse 8. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. So now the setting is Daniel is there before Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar has asked him to interpret this dream, and here's what the dream was. You care if I keep going up?
Please keep going, yes, sir.
I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So, the dream was, he saw a great tree that came up out of the midst of the earth, right? And there would not have been, in this dream, figuratively, there would not have been a person or a nation on earth that would not been able to have seen this tree. That's how great and mighty it was. And it was a beautiful tree. Its leaves were full. It was useful. It bared fruit. And it says the birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. He continues in 13. I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven. And he cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beast on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. So that goes back to what I was saying to you earlier to kind of introduce what we were going to be talking about. God has a mighty lesson that he is going to try to teach Nebuchadnezzar here. And that is the fact that Even though Nebuchadnezzar is the king and the ruler over this great empire, it wasn't because he was such a great person. It wasn't because he was such a great king. It was because why? God gave it to him. God allowed him to do that. And that's what he's trying to teach him. You have anything you want to say about the dream itself before we go into the interpretation?
Yeah, just keying in on that phrase at the end of verse 17. To the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over the lowliest of men. That phrase is going to be repeated a couple of times in the interpretation. So as Mr. Colby is pointing out, that is the thing that we need to be seeing. When you see something that says all this happened to the end, or so that, and that's the English Standard says to the end that the living may know. And I think the first living that needs to learn that lesson is Nebuchadnezzar himself. And so you'll see that beginning in verse 18 as Nebuchadnezzar is asking Daniel for the interpretation.
Yeah. And one other thing there too, I think him destroying the temple and destroying Jerusalem itself would have given him a sense of accomplishment that God says, look, I even allowed you to do that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but it could be taken in the wrong way. Right?
Yeah.
He could have drawn a conclusion that he's somehow more powerful than that God.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
That God allowed him to do that. He needs to, put all that in the right perspective.
Right. Okay. The interpretation, verse 18. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now, he asked Daniel to interpret the dream for him. And I want you to look in verse 19 at Daniel's, his response. It says, Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. So it's almost here as if Daniel is kind of perplexed, like he's caught off guard and speechless at the sight of this dream. And he is, I think. But it's not the dream itself that has him speechless and troubled. It's going to be what he knows the dream is about. Daniel knows, because God allows him to know what this dream about, and he knows it's trouble for Nebuchadnezzar, and it's going to be hard for him to relay that message to him. Nobody likes to give bad news to someone else, especially when it's somebody like a king, right? So,
and I wonder if Daniel's experience hadn't been that Nebuchadnezzar has been pretty good to him so far.
Yeah.
And so, and Daniel has insight into what Nebuchadnezzar's role was in all this. And so maybe I would take it to be that the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar needs to learn is a lesson Daniel wasn't aware he needed to learn yet. And so this is actually causing him some pain that Nebuchadnezzar is going to have to go through what
yes,
this is going to describe.
I think you're exactly right. Okay, he says, we're still in verse 19. He says, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its I'm sorry, I've already read that. Belteshazzar answered and said, My Lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, and its fruit abundant, in which food was for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. For your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven, look at verse 24. This is the interpretation, O king. This is the decree of the Most High. So this is what God says, which is going to come upon my Lord the king. They shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, and perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. So, God shows Nebuchadnezzar here that his great empire, he himself is this tree that if he doesn't change his ways, then he's going to be cut off from ruling on the earth, basically, is what it is. And it does leave a sense there toward the end of what I read that if he will change, then perhaps things could change for him. But if not, this is going to be the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think verse 27, so he's asked for the interpretation. Daniel gives him the interpretation, but he also gives him more than what he asked for. He gives him instruction in view of what that dream was about, that he can avoid the outcome of that if he will. In fact, I think basically you see the key there at the end of verse 25, that till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and then he might be restored at the end of verse 26 from the time that you know that heaven rules, right? So if he'll learn that lesson, maybe Daniel will say, maybe you can just avoid all that altogether, because that's why it's coming, till you understand that. And when you're restored, it will be because you've learned that heaven rules. And so maybe that's Daniel's instruction in view of all this, like as you may mention, that there would be a lengthening of that.
And it's kind of a sad passage to me in a way. I mean, you can kind of see why I think it could trouble Daniel as well, because to me, and I may be wrong about this, I may be speaking out of turn, but it seems to me like Nebuchadnezzar had something about him that other pagan kings wouldn't have had. It's almost like he was so close to believing in Jehovah God and submitting to him, but it's almost like he just wasn't quite there.
And may even come to it at some point, but hadn't yet, like you're saying. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. So I'm going to let Larson take, starting in verse 28, but I'm going to I'd like to make a comment to kind of launch him into it here. When we receive a message that tells us that we have done something wrong and we need to change, we need to repent, and what do we normally do? We try to do it, right? But oftentimes what happens? It lasts for a while, right? And then kind of like when the new wears off sometimes, we kind of drift right back to where we were. And it seems kind of like that might be what happens here, you know.
I think that's exactly right. So in verse 28, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Well, in what way? So in verse 29, at the end of 12 months, so that a year later, might not even be thinking about this occasion a year later, but he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, I think he answered and said to himself, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? Now, what's wrong with that statement? My. I have built by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty. When he's just been warned to understand that the reason that you're in this position of power is because the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, and he'll set over whoever he will, even if it's the lowliest of people, right? Nebuchadnezzar's identity is not the big deal here. He's not the big deal here. God is. But in verse 31, while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And you can just imagine he remembers exactly at this point what Daniel had said. And you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will. You see that that's the purpose. Until you know. That's what the lesson that needs to be drawn. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven until his hair grew long as eagle's feathers and his nails were like bird's claws. Now you might read about this and you might say, this looks like somebody's gone crazy. They had in fact done that. They had in fact gone crazy. That's what has happened in Nebuchadnezzar. But he's going through that under a judgment because of his pride. And you want to see pride being brought low, here's the occasion where that does in fact happen. Anything through verse 33 that you want to point out? It's
just as if, like the prophecy said, I mean, it's almost like all human qualities have been taken away from him almost. I mean, it's literally almost like he's an animal out in the field.
Yes, that's right. Any claim to power and glory and might that he had has been ripped away. So like, it's kind of like one of the lines, and this is not what Jesus, but the one who has, or the one who has not, what he has not, what he has will be taken away, right? Nebuchadnezzar doesn't have near as much as what he thinks he has. And the little he might actually have is ripped away from him too, and he's taken to animal status. So, at that 7 periods, you've seen that reference several times. I don't think that's a definitive amount of time. I don't think it's like 7 years. I think it's a complete amount of time, I think is the idea. I don't think we're supposed to be able to have a chronology of this necessarily. But at the end of the days, this is verse 34, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised him, and honored him who lives forever. Why? Notice this. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. You see how that connects us back up to the beginning of chapter 4? And his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? So he says, I came to the realization as an animal in the field. He came to himself. Maybe we think about the prodigal son, right? He looks up to heaven and he says, I should have recognized this all along. He does rule. He does what his will is. There's nobody who can stop God from accomplishing his purposes. Verse 36, at the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my Lord sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now, it might not seem like he's significantly more humble, but the fact that he's able to say, my greatness was added to me, right? It's not that I earned it or I got it, but that it was added to me, almost in a passive voice, like somebody else is responsible for that greatness being added. Verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Maybe that's the great lesson of chapter 4. Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Now, thinking about the people who would be reading this, thinking about Israelites maybe who are in captivity, what's the lesson that they're learning from all of this? God is in control. God is in control. That Nebuchadnezzar, even though he is the one who's exercising this power, he's not the one in control. They need to understand, as they read the book of Daniel, we start out in chapter 1, that God gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. That God was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the future was going to look like in chapter 2. That God was able to preserve Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that God is able even to humble Nebuchadnezzar when that time comes. And he can raise him back up and put him in the place that he was before, if that's necessary, or when that is an appropriate time. I think by the end of chapter 4, we have a Nebuchadnezzar who is as close as we see a pagan king coming to somebody who recognizes the authority of Yahweh, of the God of Israel, of the world, maybe we should say at this point, instead of just the God of Israel.
And this is a lesson, too, that I think is just going to continue all the way until the Lord comes back. I mean, Larson teaches about a lot of empires and leaders in history class, I'm sure. I do as well. You have all learned about all these leaders of all of these empires. Every leader of every empire that has been or will be are going to learn this same lesson one day, one way or the other, whether they were good or whether they were bad. All of them are going to know that it was God that ruled in the kingdoms of men all along. And just like you said, the humble are going to be exalted and the exalted are going to be humbled.
All right. Any thoughts through chapter 4? Any questions or comments you'd like to make? Anything you'd like to share with us? Yes, sir.
It seems as if he finally got the message. God is my God. He made him personal to himself. Notice he referenced him all the other times as the God of Daniel.
Yeah.
The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's who you should honor. He didn't say the God that I would honor.
Yeah.
Now he's come to the understanding that he is the King of heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He made the God personal.
Yeah.
And that's what we all need to do too.
Yeah.
We need to make God personal to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We need to realize that God rules my life. I don't rule anything. God rules my life.
Yeah.
And when we can come to that understanding, we will appreciate God more. We'll be like Nebuchadnezzar. We will understand that the path that I walk needs to be God's path.
There you go.
Not the path of my choosing.
That's right. Very good. Very good. Nebuchadnezzar had to learn this lesson in a difficult way. He could have learned it earlier, right? He could have learned it from somebody he already trusted telling him, and if he had, let that resonate within him and kept him from that pride. I think we'll see in chapter 5, as we kind of use what Brother Creighton just said, Nebuchadnezzar should have learned this lesson earlier. He finally does learn it. We need to learn it. I think the very point is that Belshazzar in chapter 5, I think Daniel will explicitly say, you should have learned from what your father, I don't think it was his literal father, but from his predecessor, you should have learned from what he had experienced. So if Belshazzar could have learned it, then we can learn it as we read the book of Daniel, that we can, you've accomplished a lot of great things in your life. You've never been the emperor of the Babylonian Empire, right? But even that is only established by the hand of God. And so it's not, whatever we have accomplished in our life, we don't need to look at it with arrogance or pride. We can be thankful and be grateful. We can see that it is good, maybe even great, but we ought to recognize it as a gift that's to be used in a particular way and not for our own self-esteem or whatever it might be. Okay. Anything else as we go into chapter 5? All right. So as we make our way into chapter 5, there is a transition here. I may mention this at the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562. There's some turmoil after his death. Nabonidus takes the throne. Nabonidus actually worships a god that is called Sin, S-I-N. I don't know if that's how they pronounced it, but if you worship a false god and his name's Sin, you would think that'd be pretty apparent that you shouldn't do that. But no, it was a Babylonian word, not a Hebrew word or an English word. But he worshipped. But the key god of Babylon was a guy named Marduk, right? So Belshazzar says, I'll be much more devoted to Marduk. So he is Nabonidus's co-regent. They reigned together for the last few years of Nabonidus's reign. So Nabonidus is the king, but Belshazzar is his co-king. They are king together. I think that we can bring this occasion down to the year 539 BC because of what happens at the end, and I think we can date that pretty well. Do you want to carry us through chapter 5, or do you want me to?
I can
you can get us started if you want.
Yeah, I can get us started. I think I'll just kind of summarize the first 4 verses here. So this Belshazzar that Larson is talking about, he proclaims this great feast, and he is really going to try to show the power and the might he has. And in order to do that, what he does is he calls them to bring the silver and gold vessels which had been brought to Babylon from Jerusalem. He calls for them to be brought in, and they are actually going to use those to eat and drink with. Now, why are they going to do that? This is all part of doing what? Do what? Yes, worshiping their gods is what they're doing. In verse 4, it says, they drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. That was what he was trying to accomplish. Verse 5, in the same hour they were doing this, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So the location there is interesting. It's opposite the lamp where everybody that was sitting there, it would be visible to them, just the hand, not the rest of the body, writing on the wall. Verse 6, the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. That's quite a transition there. I mean, you kind of see this man that is just full of pride and proud of what he's doing, and all of a sudden this happens, and he's so scared that his knees are knocking together. Verse 7, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he tells them, whoever can tell me what this means, what's happening here, I will make you third ruler of the kingdom. So basically what that means, excuse me, Nabonidus, the way I understand it, I think, how did you say his name?
Nabonidus, but you can say however you want.
So he would be like the ruler over the entire Babylonian Empire itself. But the way I read it, he hardly had anything to do with Babylon, That's right. The city.
That's right.
That's what he left for Belshazzar. So you have Nabonidus, the first ruler, Belshazzar, the second ruler, and whoever can interpret this writing is going to be the third ruler. You want to take us the rest of the way?
Yeah, so Belshazzar is very worried about this. Then the queen mother comes in. Now, I don't know if this is Belshazzar's mother, so Nabonidus' wife. I don't know if it's a grandmother. Some have suggested maybe this is like a wife of Nebuchadnezzar that is still in this position of priority. Whoever she is well aware of the power that Daniel has. She says, quit being worried, call this guy Daniel. So he does, and Belshazzar, almost in kind of a naive way, as if he doesn't really know who Daniel is, though Daniel tells him he should know, he kind of says, I've heard you can do this kind of stuff. If you can, I'll reward you. You'll be. And Daniel says, you can keep all that, right? You can keep all that. But you kind of have this back and forth between him. Now, I want to notice this. In verse 17, Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, his predecessor, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. Remember that story? Remember when we talked about that? 20 minutes ago? Okay. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdoms of mankind and sets over it whom he will. All right, so it's almost as if that story was told in chapter 4 just so that we could get to this statement in chapter 5 where it's going to be in real-time application for Daniel, right? So, verse 22, and you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Now, Belshazzar hasn't been turned into a beast and driven out into a field. But he knew the story about Nebuchadnezzar, about that happening to him. Evidently, there was enough information that Belshazzar should have been able to learn the lesson without having to have the experience that Nebuchadnezzar had. Brother Earnhardt used to say he should have gotten his education on Nebuchadnezzar's dime. And I think that's right. He should have learned the lesson without what was coming. But Belshazzar has gone even further in pride against God than it looks like Nebuchadnezzar even had. Because he says, this is verse 23, you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. It's not just ignoring the God of heaven. He's in opposition to him. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Now, when Daniel speaks to Belshazzar, does he seem as sad, alarmed, frustrated, bothered by the bad news that he's about to give as he did when he gave it to Nebuchadnezzar? It sounds like Daniel is on fire to give this to Belshazzar. I think Daniel sees what's being done. Maybe he's already seen it, and now he's seeing it again, and he is ready to give Belshazzar this word. Now, he says, then from his presence, that is, from the God in whose hand is your breath, right? From his presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was described, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter, meaning, which means the word itself means numbered. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means weighed and found wanting. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So he sees these four words. God has numbered your kingdom and he's brought it to an end. God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and you have been found lacking. You don't measure up to what you should. So God is going to divide your kingdom and he's going to give it to the Persians. Now, Belshazzar hears this message, and I wonder if it's because he is convinced that Daniel is right about this. Notice what he does. He clothes him with purple, a chain of gold put around his neck, and his proclamation made about him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. Belshazzar keeps his word, maybe because he's so scared of what Daniel is saying, that he's trying to honor Daniel in a way that makes it look like he doesn't have that proud, arrogant heart. But what happens that very night? He dies. He is killed by a man named Darius the Mede, and Darius the Mede receives the kingdom being about 62 years old. Now, when we talk about the Medes, we are talking about this empire right here. We will call it the Medo-Persian Empire. Cyrus will actually be the emperor of that. Darius will be the one that's referenced here. I think probably Darius was a military ruler that comes in to take control of this particular area. But in 539, with the destruction of the Babylonian kingdom, Medo-Persia will take over. And so we have the capture of Babylon by the Persians that was foretold on that night by Daniel to Belshazzar, who, between him and Nabonidus, they will be the last rulers of Babylon. It will be taken over by the Medo-Persians, and Cyrus will be the new king. And really, Daniel will make a few references in later chapters to his time back while he was under Belshazzar. But the timeline, we've now shifted into Persian period. So when we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, when we talk about all of those, they're not going to be under the Babylonians anymore. They're going to be under the Persians. And so we'll need to keep that in mind as we go along.
And,
okay. Yeah.
And yes, behind the scenes, this empire, this on that map that you showed, the Persian Empire, that's been growing all along. Even as this story that we've talked about tonight has been taking place, during all of that time, Cyrus was conquering all of this land that is up here on the map under that empire. And also one other thing that I wanted to mention too is we're also not talking about the same Daniel here that we were talking about earlier. You know, when we started talking about Daniel, he was just maybe in his late teens. Tonight, we're talking about a Daniel that is probably very well maybe in his 80s, or an older man Daniel.
Yeah. So when we come to chapter 6 next time, which next time we've got to survey a lot, 6 through 12 really. Chapter 6 is the most familiar of those stories, Daniel in the lion's den. How many pictures have you seen of him being an old man in those pictures? Very few, but he's old man Daniel at that point. And so then from 7 to 12 is more of the interpretation of dreams, the apocalyptic visions of Daniel. And so we're going to survey those just kind of in a summary, but we'll look at those, Lord willing, on Sunday night. No, this Sunday night is our singing night.
Mm-hmm.
So we will look at it next Wednesday night, Lord willing. and then be ready for that. So read chapters 6 through 12, and that way, if you have any particular questions, Mr. Colby can be ready for those next Wednesday on the apocalyptic visions of Daniel, because I won't be ready for them.
I've got bad news for you, but I'm going to save that for off the mic.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.